It became the Flying Suitcase, where pilots gasped for air in the cramped space and prayed that the engine wouldn't fail at the worst possible moment. Its landing gear broke right in front of generals' eyes. Propellers flew off into fields, and crews died by the dozens in daylight raids, while the command insisted that speed would save them. This aircraft was even shot down by its own allies, who mistook it for enemy machines. And in the Arctic, it lost more men to the weather than to enemy fire. Yet, it was on this plane that feats worthy of the highest decorations were accomplished. The story of the Handley Page Hampden is a tale of compromises, false hopes, and the price of speed, which was paid by living people. Watch until the end. The most incredible pages await you there. In the early 1930s, the British Air Ministry faced a challenge that would determine the entire strategy of the future war. They had to choose what the new bomber would be: heavy and capable of carrying a significant payload over long distances, or light and fast, with less fuel and fewer bombs, but with a chance of escaping attack. It seemed possible to find a golden mean, but in reality, each decision led to a chain of contradictions. Additional pressure came from international politics. The League of Nations was holding a disarmament conference that same year, discussing limitations on military aviation. On paper, these rules looked like a guarantee of stability, but in reality, they became fetters for engineers. The new projects were strictly limited in empty weight, so that no one could build flying fortresses. Although most experts didn't believe these restrictions would last long, designers were forced to squeeze the maximum out of these constraints. The ministry issued specification B932, a document meant to set the course for a new generation of bombers. But it turned out to be so contradictory that it frustrated even the most patient designers. On the one hand, strict limits were set on weight and engines. On the other, it remained unclear what kind of war all this was for. The enemy could be on a distant continent, requiring long range and a heavy payload, or, conversely, nearby, where the factor of speed would be decisive. As a result, the designers were given a task that essentially went against common sense: to build a light machine capable of operating as a medium bomber. This meant constant compromises. Every extra pound of metal had to be justified. Every additional device, be it armor or a machine gun post, immediately raised the question: wouldn't the aircraft become too heavy? Designers began to seek a solution in aerodynamics and new designs, trying to make the fuselage as streamlined and narrow as possible, as if sacrificing comfort for a gain in speed. This uncertainty not only created technical puzzles, but also worried the military. In meetings, some insisted on range. We must reach the enemy behind his lines. Others argued that speed was more important. Fewer bombs, but a chance to return home. There was no final decision, and specification B932 became a kind of compromise that favored no one. The paper demanded the impossible, and the engineers had to invent what did not yet exist. A question hung in the air that no one could answer directly: what price would have to be paid for choosing speed? After all, in a world slowly rolling toward a new great war, the stakes could be too high. The engineers at Handley Page knew that if the ministry insisted on lightness, new forms would have to be found. This is how the HP-52 project emerged, an aircraft that, even at the blueprint stage, challenged traditional ideas of what a bomber should look like. The designers, led by George Volkert, decided to take maximum risk and incorporate the most advanced features that could be realized in the early 30s. The fuselage was built using a semi-monocoque scheme. Instead of the usual frame with fabric covering, they used an all-metal stressed skin structure. To reduce drag, the surface was made smooth with flush rivets. The wing was equipped with Handley Page's signature slots, as well as hydraulic flaps, designed to aid during takeoff and landing. The aircraft received variable pitch 3-bladed propellers and retractable landing gear, a true leap forward for British bombers. But for the sake of weight, they had to pay in ergonomics. The fuselage was so narrow that it was nicknamed the Flying Suitcase. At its widest point, it was only slightly more than a meter, and only the nose section allowed some crew members to be placed with relative comfort. The navigator sat forward, doubling as the bombardier. The radio operator was in the middle, simultaneously servicing the auxiliary armament. Deeper towards the tail, the fuselage narrowed into a thin boom connecting the wing to the tail unit. This architecture was a compromise for the sake of grams. the pilot's narrow cockpit barely contained the controls. If the commander was incapacitated, it was nearly impossible for a comrade to climb over to the yoke. There were no provisions for long flights. The cramped conditions and lack of space, even for elementary conveniences, turned flying into an endurance test. At the same time, the engineers justified these sacrifices with the logic of the time. Speed and altitude were paramount, and crew comfort could be relegated to second place. By the spring of 1933, the first wooden mock-up was ready. It looked unusual and even slightly comical. Tall, with a narrow fuselage and a twin tail, like a giant metallic dragonfly. But this unusual silhouette concealed potential. Now, the main question remained, on which the fate of the entire machine depended. What engine would bring this bold, narrow body to life? The ministry liked good ideas on paper. The engineers liked good solutions in metal. When the conversation turned to the power plant, both wanted to win but spoke different languages. Rolls-Royce proposed the Goshawk, an evaporative cooled engine, tempting because it eliminated heavy radiators and provided a clean fuselage outline. On blueprints, this looked like the quintessence of rationalism: fewer components, less weight, more speed. In practice, the steam cooling system proved to be temperamental, requiring delicate maintenance, sensitive to operating conditions, and unforgiving of service errors. What worked tolerably in the workshops was prone to failure in field conditions. When operational reliability became more important than the nominal weight saving, the ministry sighed and backed away from the most rigid empty weight limits. This decision sounded like an admission. One cannot build everything around a single theory. Survivability and maintainability are what matter in combat. Handley Page reacted pragmatically. The design allowed for the installation of alternative units, and the choice soon fell to the Bristol Pegasus engine family. They were not as revolutionary in concept, but were superior in reliability, ease of maintenance, and parts availability. On the eve of conflict, this was no less valuable than pure speed. Modifications had to be made for the Pegasus installation. The wing was enlarged to maintain the takeoff weight-to-lift ratio. The fuselage was increased in length and slightly in volume to correct the center of gravity and add living space for equipment. Each of these changes seemed minor individually, but together they reshaped the character of the machine. The former excessive economizing gave way to a more balanced planning, where a victory for reliability was as important as a victory for speed. The introduction of two-stage supercharging on the Pegasus variants provided a tangible increase in range, an amount engineers typically referred to as a few hundred miles. This added value to the project. It could now count not only on local operations, but also on flights further than initially envisioned. However, along with the gain in radius came the realization of new risks. The extra weight and increased wing area changed the handling in maneuvers, landing, and after damage. In theory, the numbers were encouraging. In practice, confirmation in the sky was required. And so, when the mock-ups and calculations had been revised, one question remained which could not be dismissed by a blueprint or an order. Would this rebuilt design withstand real flight conditions? Would it deliver what the tables and flight tests promised? And would it not ultimately turn into that very compromise that cost too much? The summer of 1936 was the moment of truth. The first prototype, serial number K4240, took to the skies from Radlett Airfield. At the controls was the company's chief test pilot, Major Jim Cordes. The machine flew steadily, climbing faster than many competitors, and the initial impressions were encouraging. The calculations were confirmed. A week later, the prototype was shown to the public at the traditional Hendon Air Pageant. To maintain secrecy, the nose was covered with opaque paint, hiding the internal layout. But even in this state, the novelty attracted attention. The narrow fuselage and twin tail immediately set it apart. Testing continued, and the first reminders of the price of risk soon arrived. In November of the same year, the right landing gear failed during landing. The aircraft ran down the strip, scooping up grass, leaving the pilot and observer with an ironic comment about the smell of freshly cut lawn in the cockpit. And in January 1937, a much more dangerous incident occurred during a flight over Hertfordshire. The right propeller, along with the gearbox, separated from the engine, tearing through the skin behind the cockpit and flying towards the village of Elstree. Cordes managed to fly the aircraft on one engine to the airfield and landed, and it was later discovered that the propeller had slammed into a plowed field and gone so deep that only the edge of the blade was sticking out of the ground. Despite these alarming episodes, the ministry's interest did not wane. Just weeks after the first flight, an order for 180 aircraft was placed, followed by a contract for another 100 in a variant with the new Napier engine. This is how the Hampden's twin brother, the Hereford, was born, similar in appearance but with a fundamentally different power plant. At the same time, negotiations were underway with Sweden, whose interest in the project led to a protracted history of modifications to meet their demands: interchangeable landing gear for wheels, skis, and floats, photo cameras, and heavy armament. All these lines of development converged in the Handley Page workshops, and it became clear that the prototype's fate would not be limited to the role of an exhibition piece. It was necessary to understand which variant would become the basis for mass production and whether it would withstand the test, not of demonstration flights, but of real service, where mistakes are not forgiven. The spring of 1938 was marked by the appearance of what could be called the true precursor to the series. The production prototype, number L432, took to the air and was officially named Hampden, christened at a ceremony by Lady Hampden. Outwardly, it looked more finalized. The nose was now covered by a transparent perspex dome. The upper and lower gun positions were revised, but the essence remained the same. Defense was limited to a few 7.7mm machine guns. Even by the standards of the late 30s, this looked modest, but it was a conscious choice. Sacrifice armament for speed. The Hampden's main shield was proclaimed to be its ability to disengage from combat faster than the enemy. Factories prepared for mass production. Handley Page introduced a special split assembly technology. The fuselage was assembled in halves, and cables, mechanisms, and equipment were pre-installed in each half before they were joined together like parts of a scale model. This approach allowed the process to be distributed among workshops and accelerated the production rate. The idea proved timely. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the Air Ministry understood that the war would require aircraft in numbers that one factory could not handle. Therefore, English Electric in Preston was brought into the project, and overseas, the Canadian Associated Aircraft Consortium assembled from several firms. A production line was also established there to supply the British Empire with its own resources. The first operational aircraft entered squadrons by the autumn of 1938. Soon, number 49, number 83, and number 50 squadrons received their new bombers, and for the first time, pilots could assess not only the numbers from reports, but also the aircraft's behavior in daily training. The narrow fuselage and limited firing arcs raised questions, but the high maneuverability for a bomber was genuinely impressive. The Hampden was no longer a bold experiment on blueprints. It was becoming a weapon. However, along with the pride and the novelty, there was a quiet question. Would the advantage of speed alone be enough when facing a well-armed enemy? War was knocking on Europe's doors, and the answer would soon be heard not on exhibition grounds or in test reports, but in the night sky over the sea and the continent. When Britain entered the war in September 1939, 10 bomber command squadrons were equipped with the Hampden. The machine, until recently a showpiece novelty, was now one of the main tools of the offensive. But the first month showed that the reality of the front is unforgiving of illusions. Initially, the Hampden was used for reconnaissance and strikes against the German fleet in the Heligoland Bight area. The aircraft went out in broad daylight, as if inviting attack, and met well-organized defenses. In September, one sortie ended tragically. 5 Hampdens, led by Squadron Commander John Cunningham, were completely destroyed by enemy fighters. The dry figures showed, betting on speed does not save you if they are waiting for you. The losses were so significant that it became clear daylight raids could not continue in this form. By the end of the year, the strategy changed. The Hampden was transferred to night operations. The first flights in the dark were cautious. No bombs were taken. Crews learned to navigate, flew over Germany, and dropped only bundles of leaflets. These nickel raids, as they were nicknamed, were more a psychological weapon than a military one. Pilots mastered the night sky, and the enemy felt for the first time that visitors were arriving even in the dark. Gradually, the crews began to master a new role. The Hampden was transforming not only into a night bomber, but also into a carrier of an unusual weapon. In the spring of 1940, the aircraft were modified to lay 2,000-pound naval mines, gardening missions. On the night of April 13th, days after the German invasion of Norway, the Hampden first used this weapon, dropping mines in waters the Royal Navy ships could not enter. The operation was successful, and soon hundreds of such sorties turned the Hampden into an important part of the mine warfare effort. The spring and summer of 1940 became a true test of endurance for the Hampden. After the fall of France, the front line drew closer to the shores of Britain, and the tasks for the bombers became sharply more difficult. Now they were sent not only for reconnaissance or mine-laying, but also for strikes against Germany's industrial centers themselves. On the night of May 10th, the day the German offensive began in Holland and Belgium, the Hampden was among those that attacked railway junctions and troop columns, and soon after the bombing of Rotterdam, it received the order to strike the Ruhr. Crews left for the east in whole groups, but they did not always find the target. Navigation equipment for night conditions was primitive, and only a small fraction of bombs reached the intended target. The Hampden participated in raids meant to be symbolic answers to the strikes on Dutch cities, but their effect was more moral than strategic. However, every raid provided invaluable experience in night bombing, and pilots gradually learned to operate in the dark more confidently. Attacks on German ports proceeded in parallel. The greatest attention was paid to Kiel Harbor, where heavy enemy ships were based. In July, one Hampden, flown by a young officer named Guy Gibson, who would later become the famous commander of the Dam Busters, first dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on the port. The target was the battlecruiser Scharnhorst, but the attempt was unsuccessful. The Hampden proved too vulnerable in the face of powerful anti-aircraft defenses, and such raids were accompanied by significant losses. To somehow increase their chances, commanders resorted to improvisation. Vickers K twin machine guns were hastily mounted in the upper and lower positions in the workshops. Sometimes, additional fixed forward firing guns were installed in the side openings. This made the cockpits even more cramped and overloaded the crew, but it allowed them to at least partially fight back. However, by mid-1940, it became obvious that the concept of speed instead of armor was exhausted. The enemy was strengthening fighter cover, and night interceptors and anti-aircraft batteries were becoming denser, while the Hampden remained too vulnerable. Four-engined heavy bombers, the Stirling, the Halifax, and then the Lancaster, were already looming on the horizon, set to change the very philosophy of strategic raids. The Hampden was still in service, but it was becoming more of a transitional form, a symbol of a time when engineers and the military still believed that speed could replace protection. By early 1941, the Hampden was still considered the workhorse of bomber command, but its weaknesses were becoming too obvious. Large raids, conceived as a response to the Luftwaffe strikes, showed merciless statistics. The deeper the groups penetrated into German territory, the more crews failed to return. German anti-aircraft defenses were acquiring new batteries, and fighters with searchlights and radar were appearing more frequently in the night sky. The Hampden, narrow and fast by mid-30s standards, now looked fragile and unprotected. When, in May 1942, the British command decided on the symbolic 1,000-bomber raids on Cologne, Essen, and Bremen, everything that could fly was sent into the sky. Hampdens flew alongside the four-engine Stirling and Halifax, but the comparison was not in their favor. Where the new heavy machines carried several tons of bombs and had powerful defensive armament, the Flying Suitcase carried much less and defended itself with just a few machine guns. Even experienced crews admitted that their presence in such operations seemed more like a necessary measure than a real force. Nevertheless, the Hampden still tried to remain useful. In February 1942, an episode occurred that went down in the chronicles as the Channel Dash. The German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the cruiser Prinz Eugen, risked breaking through the strait right under Britain's nose. Everything that could fly was scrambled to intercept, including 5 Hampden squadrons. The aircraft attacked the ships through clouds and anti-aircraft fire, but the result was disastrous. 8 Hampdens were shot down, and several more were lost to damage. Such a fight was too heavy for a light bomber. By the end of the summer, it was clear that the Hampden was no longer needed in the role of a frontline medium bomber. Its place was being taken by heavy aircraft with greater range and bomb load. But the aircraft was not yet scrapped. It proved too valuable to be written off immediately. A new niche opened up for it: maritime operations, where range and the ability to carry a torpedo could offer a second life. The only question was whether this reorientation would endure, or whether the Hampden would also prove to be nothing more than a temporary solution here. When it became clear that the Hampden could no longer compete as a classic bomber, its fate was unexpectedly decided. In Gosport, where the torpedo experimental unit was working, attention was drawn to the narrow fuselage and decent range of the machine. In early 1941, the first Hampdens were converted to the TB-MKI torpedo bomber variant. The bomb bay doors were removed, as the 18-inch torpedo did not fit entirely, and its body protruded a few inches downwards. Externally, this looked crude, but the aircraft remained within the permissible weight limits and retained a range of nearly 2,000 miles. Squadrons number 144 and number 455 were among the first to receive the upgraded aircraft and were transferred to Coastal Command. They were followed by units from Canada and New Zealand. The torpedo Hampden proved to be in demand. It could carry not only its primary weapon, but also depth charges, escorting convoys and attacking enemy vessels. A special chapter was opened by the Northern convoys. In 1942, several dozen Hampdens were to fly to the Soviet Union to reinforce the anti-submarine defense of the convoys heading to Murmansk. The transfer proved to be agonizing. Weather conditions on the route through Norway and Sweden claimed many aircraft, and those that made it were met with new challenges. The Hampden silhouette was too reminiscent of the German Dornier Do 17, and Soviet fighters often mistook the Allies for the enemy. They had to lower their landing gear to show their allegiance, but even this didn't always save them. Several aircraft were hit by friendly fire. The remaining 23 aircraft were transferred to the Soviet Air Force, where they were used against German ships in the north. They managed to conduct a number of successful attacks, but every loss became irreplaceable. Spare parts ran out, no new aircraft arrived, and by the end of 1943, the unit was disbanded. In Britain, the situation was similar. The torpedo Hampdens were gradually replaced by the more powerful and reliable Bristol Beaufighter. Thus ended the operational career of the Flying Suitcase. It did not become a symbol of strategic raids and did not survive until victory as a full-fledged frontline bomber. But it managed to find its second purpose, passing from daylight raids over Germany to escorting northern convoys in the icy mists. Only one question remained. What would be remembered about an aircraft that disappeared from the front almost as quickly as it appeared? The Hampden story flared up like a bright fire and almost immediately faded. Its operational life was short, but it left behind episodes that are forever etched in the annals of the war. In August 1940, 11 Hampdens attacked the German aqueduct over the Ems River. Among them was the crew of Roderick Leroyd. His aircraft was severely damaged. The hydraulics failed. Landing seemed impossible. But he carried the attack through to the end, dropped his bombs, and managed to bring the machine home. Leroyd circled the airfield all night, waiting for dawn to land the Hampden without its landing gear and without risk to the crew. For this act, he became the first Bomber Command pilot to be awarded the Victoria Cross. A month later, another story forever linked the Hampden to heroism. During a raid on Antwerp, German anti-aircraft fire hit a bomber. Fire broke out in the cockpit. The navigator and gunner bailed out, but the radio operator, John Hanna, stayed. The fire extinguishers ran out, and he began to put out the flames with his hands until his skin was burned. He managed to save the aircraft and his comrades, and for this, he also received the highest award. Such episodes show that even a machine with compromises and limitations could become an instrument of heroism if people at its controls were ready to see the job through. But the Hampden's career itself was too short. By the middle of the war, it had given way to new heavy bombers, and the remaining fleet was used for crew training. It was in training centers, far from the front, that the Hampden spent its last years, transforming from a combat unit into a trainer for future Lancaster and Halifax crews. After the war, almost all aircraft were scrapped. They were not preserved as relics, being considered an intermediate stage rather than a symbol. Only a few Hampdens survived by a miracle. One is restored at the Canadian Museum of Flight. Another is being reassembled from parts in Cosford, and one was salvaged from a Swedish swamp and is being brought back to life. But compared to the hundreds of Lancasters or Wellingtons, the memory of the Hampden fades. Yet, it is the Hampden that reminds us, speed cannot replace protection, and a bold engineering idea without a safety margin turns into a vulnerability. The Hampden became an example of how compromises made for the sake of specifications on paper can shorten a machine's life in real combat. Today, its history is no less important than the fate of its successful counterparts because it contains a lesson. Any reliance on a one-sided advantage ultimately becomes a price that must be paid on the battlefield.